Hi, I'm Merryn Somerset Webb, Editor-in-Chief of MoneyWeek magazine, and today I have with me Professor Steve Keen. Now, several of you have asked me to interview him, and as you know, I always respond to your requests, so here he is with us today. He's the author of this, Debunking Economics, which you will all want to read by the end of the interview, and has a new book coming out soon. What's the new book called, Steve?
It's called Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis?
Oh my God, can we? We'll come to that in a minute. I think we had better start with Brexit.
Yep.
Now, you were, I think you were a Leave voter.
I was.
So maybe we can just talk through why you were a Leave voter and why you're pleased with the result, even after the volatility of the last few years.
Yeah.
Last few years, last few days.
Last few days. Well, actually, last few years is a pretty good way to frame it as well, of course. Volatility, how unusual. But yeah, I took it in my Forbes article. I said I'm asking myself a Groucho Marxist question. I'm in a club. Do I want to be here? And the answer is no, because everything what the club's motto is almost the opposite of what it actually does. It's got a club which talks about inclusiveness, bringing Europe together, promoting peace, harmony and economic growth, and it's done almost the exact opposite of all those things because of an ideology which dominates the policy and the framing of the policies of the European Union. And I think it should break up. And I think, in fact, if we'd actually managed to get the Remain vote through, we might have remained in a club that abolished itself a couple of years later after we decided to stay in it.
Would that not have been slightly less disruptive, maybe? Much
more disruptive, because if the break that I'm expecting does come, and I know Mervyn King has similar sympathies here, it could be with a right-wing, let's use the word, proto-fascist party like the National Front in France deciding to break out of the euro. And if people think the change, England leaving a set of treaties is massively disruptive and, you know, the beginning of Armageddon as we know it, wait till France or Italy leaves. That's much, much more dramatic.
Well, they have to leave the Eurozone,
they have to
not
leave
just
the Eurozone.
the EU.
So I thought, in some sense, this has been a catastrophe which if you had a clear set of binoculars, you could have seen coming right from the day of the Maastricht Treaty. And one thing I really highly recommend your readers to look at is this brilliant article, you may not know it, by Wynne Godley, written in 1992. Ever seen it?
No.
It's in the London Review of Books, and the title of the article is Maastricht and All That. And he wrote it within weeks of the signing of the treaty, maybe even before it was signed. I don't think it would have been publicised before it was signed. And he said that the people who framed this treaty, since they only decided to create a central bank and not a treasury as well, and they put these huge limits on what the treasuries themselves, the national treasuries, could do, they must believe capitalism is inherently stable. Since it is not, when a crisis comes along, the rules of the Maastricht Treaty and the absence of a redistributive mechanism through treasuries and taxations across countries will force countries in decline to continue cutting spending, leading to a downward spiral, the only escape from which will be emigration or death. Now, he wrote that in 1992 in the London Review of Books, and I'm sure people reading said, what an extremist, how ridiculous, how exaggerated. He was spot on. I think it must go down to one of the most prescient articles ever written in history of economics. That's not hard, I know, but you know, it's a remarkably good article, and he got it dead right. The euro is, I called it in my first edition of Debunking Economics, I called it a collective suicide note.
And of course the UK effectively has ended up the employer of the last resort for the people immigrating from those countries. Exactly.
This is why migration has been such an issue, because since you signed up, you didn't sign up for the euro, which was one of the best decisions. I know that both Maggie Thatcher and the previous Labour leaders were involved in deciding not to join it, which is, you know, they've got to give them great credit for that. You know, both sides of politics. Because it didn't do that, it didn't have the catastrophe of having the Maastricht Treaty rules imposed on it, which would mean unemployment now. If England had been part of the euro when the crisis hit back in 2008, then unemployment here might be 20%. 15%, you know, nothing like what it is right now.
Instead of which we've been able to take in pretty much everybody else.
Well, that's the trouble. Because England is, in terms of migration, that's the trouble. Because England didn't go down with the euro, but it was because of the European Union, it was open to migration from the regions that were part of the euro, then a huge wave of youth who have got no prospect of getting a job in their own countries have come over here to work, all sorts of professions, and it doesn't matter in the city because that means you get cheaper cappuccino. You know, the city's quite happy about that. But if you're in the countryside or what used to be the industrial heartland of England, and you're lining up for public services which have been slashed under austerity by Cameron, Okay, so there's less services even for the existing national population, and then suddenly all these other people have rights to the same services, and your jobs have been destroyed by the deindustrialisation that's gone with the last 30 or 40 years of globalisation. No wonder people develop racist sentiments towards it. Okay, it's unfortunate, it's dreadful, but this is the cause.
Yeah, so the core problem here for the UK is that we have no say over the way the Eurozone economies are managed.
Exactly.
But we pick up the pieces afterwards because we're outside the Eurozone. And this is something that's quite unrecognised, really. So in a way, you could say that the position is such that the Eurozone and non-Eurozone countries were always going to have to separate in terms of freedom of movement of people in order to stop having to pick up the pieces
the only
of
way
bad
the only
policy.
way that would not be a necessity would be if the Eurozone worked.
Yeah.
It's clearly failed, but we're trapped into the consequences of a failing monetary union, and therefore the sensible decision is to let's get away from it. Then Europe itself has to deal with those consequences, because if you think of the level, we look at unemployment figures for Greece and Spain and places like that, and they're dreadful. They're 25% of the population and 50% of the youth. Imagine what they'd be if those people who are currently working as baristas around the city and
we're still in their home countries.
Still in their own countries, and so we're a release valve for the disaster of the Eurozone.
Yeah.
And I would rather say, take your relief. We're taking away the relief zone. You have to deal with the consequences. Because there's a level of denial in Brussels about it's actually Brussels policies which have turned a serious economic crisis into a serious economic catastrophe.
When we talk about it like this, it seems even more bizarre to me that the EU wasn't prepared to make concessions, real concessions, to the UK pre-vote. In that, it seems obvious to us that the UK is picking up an awful lot of the pieces of European disaster, and you would have thought everyone would like to keep that release valve there.
You're presuming something. You're assuming something which almost qualifies you to be an economist.
Rationality. Now let's move on to what will happen next in our Brexited economy, and let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we go ahead with it, and that these odd anti-democracy moves for a second referendum or a cancellation of the referendum because Leavers are stupid. Let's assume that this doesn't happen, and we go through with Brexit, and we invoke Article 50, say in October, September, something like that.
Yeah.
We have a 2-year negotiation period. What are the risks for the UK there?
Well, the main risks would be that the European Union decides to be vindictive about it and to put punitive terms on England, so that England gets a worse trade deal than, say, for example, the United States in exporting to the Eurozone. Now, if you look at the average tariff that America faces in exporting into the European Union, it's 2%.
Yeah.
If we were back in the 50s and 60s when tariffs were 20, 30, 40, 50%, then going from being inside a free trade zone to being outside it could have a serious impact on the saleability of British commodities into that market. 2%. I think it's 0 for computers. It's about 10% for cars and about 30% for clothing.
And agriculture is high, isn't it? There's a different regime for agriculture.
Yeah, but again, you've actually
major
told me about
exports,
some of the agricultural disasters of being within the system to begin with. So yes, there'd be some issues there, but it is something that the scale of change could actually be quite trivial. It would go from no tariff to 2% average. I'm not going to have a panic attack over that.
Well, particularly not given that we're a service exporter in the main, aren't we?
Which is one of the problems of the English economy, frankly, because it's made the decision to it's going to become what they call a post-industrial society. And I've always said, yep, there is a post-industrial society. It's called hunting and gathering. Okay, I think it's nonsense to say you can have a genuinely post-industrial society, because when we talk services, what we're really talking about is reducing debt. Okay, fundamentally, services. Okay, we need hairdressers, we need coffee makers, etc., etc. But when people talk services, fundamentally you're talking the financial sector. Now, what's happened from Maggie Thatcher on, and believe me, it's literally, it starts with Maggie, is an explosion in the level of private debt generated in the English economy, and their capacity to do financial deals.
When we say private debt, what are we talking about? Household debt? We're talking about corporate debt? We're talking about both?
Household plus corporate, yeah. And like it's one of the problems of trying to analyse debt, which is a major focus of my economics, is that the data on the financial sector's own debt is really a mess. And it's such a mess that I normally don't include it in my figures, and neither does the Bank of International Settlements. But if you look at the plot, this is turning up in my next book, if you look at the level of private debt in England from about 1880 through to 1980, it up and down, but it's basically flatlining at about 60% of GDP. Maggie gets in, a couple of years later it just goes on a rocket ship forward.
And that's a result of deregulation.
That's a result of deregulation. Now that's what the financial services sector has been. And the thing is, that can only continue working as a good business plan so long as you continue riding the rocket to the moon. But you simply can't do that. You don't get off the planet by levering yourself all the time. You cannot sustain an infinite debt to income ratio. So it hit the wall. That was what the whole financial crisis was about. And so
hit the wall in that it stopped rising.
Stopped rising.
People were
fallen.
unable to take on more debt.
Yeah, it's actually fallen. As a percentage of GDP and partly in absolute terms, it's fallen. So the idea that you can have a services sector, a service sector-driven economy, presumes you can continue creating debt faster than GDP grows indefinitely, and you can't do it. So I think it was another big mistake of the English political scene, and this is I'm going to blame Maggie Thatcher now. It's great for not going inside the euro, but disastrous for believing you can have a services-led economy.
Okay, so this brings us to what you think is the core problem with the UK. So Brexit or no Brexit, the UK economy is, from as far as you see it, in big trouble anyway.
Yeah, and this is the reason that I'm such a maverick in economics, and I've been a maverick to some extent within my own maverick faction of economics. I focus on the role of credit in a capitalist economy, and the reason that credit matters is that it's part of demand. Now, when you look at conventional thinkers like Krugman, and the vast majority of economies, including Mervyn King on this particular front, though Mervyn has come a long, long way since the experience of the financial crisis.
He's developed since he came out of the central bank community.
Dramatically, okay, and I really appreciate what he did on the Brexit vote and his calmness and sense. That's no criticism there whatsoever. But conventional economists are trained to believe that credit doesn't matter, because if I'm going to spend more money by borrowing, I've got to borrow it from you. Your spending power goes down because you've lent me the money. Mine goes up because I borrowed it from you. The two cancel out, in the aggregate, no effect. That's really the mental picture, and that's in terms of a technical model, they call it the model of loanable funds. And it's completely wrong as a description of the monetary system of a capitalist economy, because banks, when we're not borrowing from banks, banks don't have a big warehouse of cash out the back, and somebody comes in and says, I wanted some cash, and they shovel it out the door, and therefore, and they're spending from that warehouse as well, this is the vision, so the bank can spend less, so you can spend more, and garbage. A bank is simply a double entry bookkeeping engine. You come for a bank and ask for a loan, they say, here, okay, that's it. We reckon you've got the collateral to handle this. If you go bad, we've got asset backing, so we can get the assets out of you. But you want $1 million to buy that house, or £1 million, here's £1 million. Bank assets rise by $1 million. Your deposits also rise by $1 million. So the creation of loans creates money, and you spend that money. So a huge part of the source of demand is new debt. And my simple metric, and as I go through the logic of it, not with mathematics I might add, but just simple using tables to show the case in the new book, the total demand in the economy is the sum of the turnover of existing money, which is largely inaccurately measured by our GDP figures, but it's reliable enough.
But our GDP figures are sort of, when anyone actually goes to look at how GDP figures are calculated, they're totally amazed by the whole thing. They find it's just a pile of estimates collected from companies around the country.
Oh, it's an awful survey.
Anyway, sorry,
but we could actually just simply link ourselves up to. I've got to tell you my favourite joke, by the way, about Brexit.
Okay, go on then.
Okay, that was, I've forgotten who said it, but it said that England has exited the European Union twice. Okay, once because of Iceland, and once because people who shop at Iceland. Funnily enough, I shop at Iceland. It's my local shop in Lower Marsh.
I think I have an Iceland near me. Yeah. Or a Waitrose, stuck in the middle with Sainsbury's. Anyway, back to
I've lost my train of
GDP
thought.
numbers.
Yeah, GDP numbers are totally inaccurate. Not totally, but they're very badly collected. They're based on a survey. They have to be revised all the time. It's shoddy statistics.
But nonetheless, that's what we can base turnover on.
And if we actually linked ourselves to the tills of Iceland's and Sainsbury's and Waitrose and so on, we can actually get minute by minute calculations of what the total turnover of money in the economy is. So that's GDP. Okay. Then you add to that credit, because your total expenditure is going to be the sum of what you spend out of your existing money plus any new debt you take on, and it does not cancel. Okay? So your total expenditure is your income plus your change in debt, which is your access to credit. That gets to the national level. You put the two together, and total demand is therefore sum of GDP plus change in debt. It also becomes total income. Complicated stuff, which I explain in the next book, but the basic story is you can say that total demand in an economy is the sum of GDP plus change in debt, private debt. Now, putting that together, that's why I saw the financial crisis coming, because what you had was with the level of private debt to GDP rising from 60% back at when Maggie was in charge to 200% of GDP shortly after the crisis hit. What you had was this huge increase in debt every year, which the change in debt is credit. So at various times it got to be responsible for about, say, 20 or 30% of total demand each year was credit. Now, of course, you reach that peak level, people are going bankrupt because they can't pay back their debts, the banks are getting worried about whether their borrowers can continue going. Then the lending stops, and suddenly your demand goes from a large amount of credit-based demand to zero credit demand, or even negative.
Or negative.
Yeah, and that's what brings on the crisis. So that's the state we're now in. So in England's case, it went from, what about 1980, roughly, when Maggie came in for about then, 60% of GDP to 200%. So 1.4 times GDP was was spent over those years. Now it's fallen from 200% to 170%. It's still headed down as a percentage of GDP.
Where do you think it will end?
Unfortunately, it's going to probably stabilise around this level, because if you get, and this is the great danger of trying to reduce your debt by reducing your spending is a component of GDP. And this is what way back in the 1930s Irving Fisher called I name it the debt dilemma, or a paradox of debt. And as he put it, the more debtors pay, the more they owe. Because if and this is certainly in the context of the 1930s when most of the debt was owed by businesses rather than households, if you're in debt as a business and you know you're going to go bankrupt unless you pay that debt back, then you think, I'm going to cut my prices, drag in the customers to my shop rather than the next door shop, get the revenue and pay my debt off. But when you do it, the price level falls. Okay? And you've got to then finance yourself you've got an existing debt, which is in money terms, you kind of finance out of a turnover of existing money, and the price level's dropped. So what you get as a result of that is the debt level falls and the GDP might even fall faster. So your debt ratio can rise. Now, Japan, and this is why I find
so just to be clear, debt in that sense causes deflation, which causes the real value of the debt to rise. So
that's right.
The more debt you try and pay back, the higher your debt goes in real terms.
Good summary. So that's exactly the situation Japan has been in now since 1990. And in Japan's case, they went from they've always had a high level of private debt because the what do they call that system, the keiretsu system they have, where there's a sort of conglomerate of industrial and financial. Most of the financing of industry was done by borrowed money rather than by equity through Japan's revival from the end of the Second World War. So they had an average debt level of about 1.5 times GDP until about 1980. Now in 1980 they got what they call the bubble economy, and it rose ultimately to 2.25 times GDP. You then had the deflation coming in from 1990 on, declining credit, and the debt level fell, but it's now fallen to about 1.75 times GDP, and it's been there for 10 years. It goes up and down, up and down. What it means is on one side of the crisis, in Japan's case, I think in the final year of the bubble economy, credit was responsible for about 40% of aggregate demand. Okay? It comes down to being minus 2% roughly from 1990 on. So rather than total demand being GDP plus this huge slab of credit, it's GDP minus this small reduction in credit, and consequently that's where their stultified economy has come from.
And this is but this is the problem that QE, for example, has been designed to try and deal with, to create inflation that will deal with the debt problem, and clearly it's not working.
Absolutely, and this is where. And that's why I wrote Debunking Economics, as I argue in the preface there that neoclassical economics, which is the dominant paradigm of economics today, is more dangerous to capitalism than any number of left-wing revolutionaries, because it's a completely misguided vision of how capitalism functions. And if you follow a misguided vision, managing a complex system or trying to manage a complex system like a capitalist economy, you're going to stuff up.
Okay,
and
so
QE
why is QE
classic
so
stuff
misguided?
Huh?
Why is QE so misguided?
Okay, QE is, the basic principles behind QE are twofold. One is you create these extra reserves for the banks because you're buying bonds off them, you're giving them cash instead, so their holdings of bonds goes down and their reserves, which are cash, go up. They'll lend the cash to the public, part one. And I'm quoting Bernanke here too, by the way. Okay. Part two is that you drive down interest rates, so you make safe assets less attractive, so you buy risky assets. Okay. And part three is that people feel wealthier because those risky assets rise in value, and they'll spend more because of the wealth effect. Those are the basic arguments in favour of QE. Point one, violates accounting laws. Okay? Banks cannot lend reserves. And my hat off to the Bank of England for a wonderful paper they wrote back in the beginning of 2014 or 2015, I think it was 2014, called Money Creation in the Modern Economy.
Yeah.
It was basically an open letter to the conventional economists of the world saying, wake up guys, you have got a totally wrong model of how money's created. Banks do not lend reserves, period. They can't lend them. It's like saying I can use the oil in my car as fuel. No, you can't. The oil in your car makes sure the cylinders turn over. It is not what's powering the cylinders. So there's two separate circulation systems. The banks themselves have accounts as customers of the central bank, and that's what QE is boosting, those particular accounts. That's like the oil, because those reserves are then used by banks when people like you and me make some sort of let's say if I sold that book to you rather than giving it as a gift to MoneyWeek, you might grab your credit card to act, or give me you swipe your card to buy it off me. You might bank with Barclays, I bank with Lloyds. There's going to be a transfer of reserves between the two banks. That's what's actually going on. That's like it's the oil for our personal transactions. You can't use that oil as petrol. But fundamentally, that's what the economic model of banks lending reserves actually is. It's totally fallacious. That's one out the window. Okay? The second one about giving them reserves and making risky assets more desirable, that's true. Okay, that has worked to some extent. And on top of it, and I'm not sure about this, but I think it's logically feasible, is that banks themselves, having a drop in income-earning assets, which are what their bonds were that they've sold as part of QE, and an increase in the cash, that gives them non-income-earning assets in place of income-earning assets. Also, I think QE in England differs from QE in America, because in America I think they only bought bonds off the banks, whereas here they're buying bonds off pension funds. And
they're buying them in the market, which is different because it injects money directly into asset markets.
So that actually boosts the amount of money in the economy, but it's money which is given to people who can, organisations, which can only spend that money buying other assets. Okay, so it drives up demands for assets. That's where the higher prices have come from. But of course, that means everybody in the markets, and I feel this when I talk to family offices and things like that, they are feeling the stress of the level of the value of their assets, depending upon whether central banks continue or stop doing QE. And as you were saying earlier, we're talking about the farming sector. It's the same thing. You've got to worry about a subsidy. And capitalism is stressful enough without wondering whether bureaucrats are going to change the definition of the level of the subsidy on you or not. So that has worked to drive up asset values. But has it caused a wealth effect? Well, in a sense, yes, it has, because in classic Wolf on Wall Street, the Wolf of Wall Street manner, the pension funds, the stockbrokers and so on have been clipping this and getting a nice amount of extra income as real cash to them, which they then spend into the economy. But it's trivial as a component of the total economic demand. If you wanted to stimulate demand, you'd give it not to stockbrokers and so on, and it's a tiny fraction of that they actually get to spend. You give it to people through what is called people's QE.
Well, we also worry that the wealth effect is negative in many ways, because very low rates, particularly in an aging society, very low rates make people feel slightly panicked.
And also lots of people,
they know that if they're getting a very low income, a very low yield, they need a much higher level of capital. So even though the value of their assets have gone up, they still feel obliged to save more and more and more. And we know that in terms of pension savings for people my age, for example. People my age, instead of thinking, oh well, the value of the capital value of my pension fund has gone up, we think, oh my God, I'm going to need quadruple what I needed 10 years ago to have a decent income in retirement. So the wealth effect in that sense is negative, and that I think is not in any of the models.
No, and in fact it's turning up in German politics right now too, because German pensioners tend to be more savings oriented than speculating in the stock market, and they're seeing lousy returns. And
they're not spending.
Yeah, they're not spending. So the German pensioners are actually arguing against QE. So one of the classic things. I mean, if you want to prove something is wrong, quote Greenspan saying it's right. Okay, and there was a Greenspan interview where he quoted a paper, a Federal Reserve paper, about how there's a wealth effect from shares, and the paper found there was no wealth effect from shares. The only wealth effect they found was from housing, and it was fairly minor. So we have a false model of money lending, the reserve idea, driving up asset values when inflated asset values are part of the problem. They're too high, the debt level themselves levered up asset prices, and then believing in a wealth effect that doesn't exist.
Is there a wealth effect from housing in the UK? You said there's one in the US. Is there one here?
Well, there's more. I mean, the US is more into the flipping houses game than England is, but I think the wealth effect for England really comes out of foreign buying. And the scale of foreign buying here and the extent to which people are allowed to buy properties and not live in them and just use them as either ways to hide hot money from, nice legitimate businesses in Russia and Saudi Arabia and China is phenomenal. And of course their money then turns up circulating in the economy. So in some ways, London in particular has sold its way out of the crisis by selling foreign houses to foreign buyers who then don't live there. Huge cash injection to the economy that way.
Yeah, and we sort of assumed that the London housing market had peaked and would now be coming off, but the fall in the pound again makes it cheaper for foreign buyers, so that may not be the case after all. Yeah,
it's strange. I mean, because Australia's got a similar situation, of course. And there's a big difference between the Australian market and the English market, and that is that in England, mortgage debt has been falling. It's fallen quite substantially from its peak. And what that means is it can actually go back up again. Okay? Whereas in Australia, I think mortgage debt in England, I'm not sure of the exact figures, but they'll be in my book. But because I'm looking, like aggregate private debt is 1.7 times GDP. So let's say 0.8 or 0.9 of that is household debt. Well, let's say a mortgage debt level, let's say 80% of GDP. But it peaked much higher than that. So you could actually have it going back up again, and therefore driving up house prices, though the mechanism is more complex than just that. But in Australia, the mortgage level I think is 1.2 times GDP. They are so highly levered that the continuation of that trend is just out of the question, and therefore that's got to go down, and that will drag house prices down with it. England's still got a capacity for an acceleration of mortgage debt to cause rising house prices. So I'm not going to say that I expect a house price in London, crash in London, but I do expect one
in Australia.
In Australia, the only salve there is whether the currency effects mean you get more Chinese buyers of Australian housing, because with the whole currency depreciation thing, if you're buying as a speculative investment and they've got you're buying into a market with a falling currency, you want to get out of there. That's what happened to the Japanese back in 1990, again in Sydney in particular. But if you're buying because you want cheap housing for your kids to get away from a polluted environment and potential political turmoil in either Russia or China or Saudi Arabia, hey, I can buy twice as many properties.
Yeah, you'll keep buying. Let's get back to people's QE.
Yeah.
You're keen on that?
I am, but with a twist.
In fact, can you just describe for us what people's QE is before we move on?
Okay. Well, QE as it exists is the central bank buys assets off either the private banks or the pension funds, which creates money either in the reserves for the banks or it creates money in the finance sector. Okay. Yep. People's QE would be like a tax refund. If you got a tax refund electronically, the central bank would credit your account with X amount of money. Okay. And like in Australia's case, this was done as part of the attempt to soften the blow of the financial crisis when it hit back in 2008. The Australian government gave roughly $1,000 per person who'd paid their taxes that year, at that time. And that was spent directly into the economy. Conventional economic theory, and you read Bernanke on this, it's all the worries. Do people believe it's permanent? If they believe it's permanent, then they might spend it. If they don't, they'll save it. Nonsense. You get $1,000 or pounds ejected in your account.
They spent it?
You spend it.
Because the Japanese didn't. I don't know if you remember the Japanese vouchers.
Pardon?
The Japanese voucher system back in the 90s. There were a few occasions when they handed out just shopping vouchers to the Japanese, and they did spend them, but they cut back spending elsewhere.
That's possible, but what I would use it for is to reduce debt, and that's my little twist. I would inject the money into people's accounts, independent of whether they were in savers who had no bank debt or borrowers who had bank debt. If you had bank debt, the money goes against your bank debt and reduces the debt. If you're a saver, you get a cash injection. So I'm basically arguing we need to do what the ancients used to do, which have regular debt jubilees.
Yeah, so that is effectively a debt jubilee, isn't it?
It's a debt jubilee. That's what I want to have.
But it's a fair debt jubilee because it gives people without debt a financial boost as well.
That's right. So if you go back to the ancient times, the Sumerians were the first ones to bring in debt jubilees on a regular basis. And the reason was that there's a beautiful set of cuneiform tablets that describe this that friends of mine have translated. And what you find is they effectively show an exponential increase in debt over time and a sort of sigmoidal increase in agricultural productivity up, and then it plateaus. And then they show a point, .. cut the debt back to zero and start the whole system all over again. And what was happening, because you're taking out debt for buying the agricultural inputs you needed for production, and half the time the harvest would fail, more and more people were becoming debt slaves. So if you couldn't pay your debt back, you became a slave, quite literally, and you worked on the farm with the moneylender. Now, as they kept on going, there were less and less freemen in the Sumerian civilization, and the only people who could fight in the army were the freemen.
Okay, so they had a big incentive.
They had a big incentive. Either you solve the debt problem or you get invaded. Okay, fairly dramatic choice. So back in those days, when you abolished the debt, the landlords and the moneylenders lost out comparatively, but the first way they lost out was rather more painful than just losing the debt. Okay, so execution was the other alternative. So the moneylenders got used to this, and then it became part of the society that over time you knew that either in 7 times 7 years, 49 years, or every time there was a change of ruler, all the debts would be cancelled and the debt slaves would be freed. They could go back onto their own farms and continue working again. Now, of course, in that sort of society, there's only a tiny minority that lose out of the debt jubilee. It's a weird form of loss, because you lose money, but you don't lose your life, and you don't become a slave of another civilization if you get invaded. But these days, there's lots of people who are ordinary people who don't have any debt. I'm one of them. Others who have lots of debt. And when I was talking about a debt jubilee, people say, what about people who only save money? You're penalising them by just letting the debtors off. I said, okay, we have a central bank system these days, which means that we can easily create the money using the central bank's capacity to create money, put that in bank accounts independent of whether you're a saver or a borrower. The borrowers get their debt levels reduced, but the savers get a cash injection. And you have to also reform banking, which is going to make me very popular in the city. Sorry guys, you can't make money by financing Ponzi schemes anymore, which is fundamentally what lending to housing is.
That's going to be disappointing for people.
They won't like that. Okay, but the responsible role of private banking in a capitalist economy is to provide working capital for companies that need working capital, to provide money to consumers for large consumer items they can't themselves buy out of their income, which includes housing and cars and things like that. And most importantly, to actually give you a genuine capitalist system to fund entrepreneurs. Now, banks used to provide working capital when lines of credit were a common form of finance up to the 1990s. But they've made lines of credit so expensive now, that's where the whole commercial paper market came from, which of course the city finances that and thoroughly enjoys it. But banks aren't providing working capital. They're providing consumer credit, and consumers are very responsible about credit that's not related to housing. Okay? The main thing they've got into is, hey, we can sell to people for house price purchases, and the actual lending of the money causes a bubble, which then encourages people in, and we get these runaway bubbles in private debt. And entrepreneurs, they don't fund entrepreneurs for the simple reason that 4 out of 5 of them are going to fold. If you lend to them, you lose your principal, 80% of your principal gets lost, you hang on to 20% and you get interest on 20% of your principal. It's a bad business deal. So I would rather say, let's make it impossible for banks to cause bubbles in house prices by limiting lending to the income earning capacity of the asset being bought, okay, which would stop that positive feedback that leads to runaway house prices. But then make it possible for banks to make what I'm calling EALs, which stands for entrepreneurial equity loans. So when you lend to an entrepreneur, not to everybody of course, but to entrepreneurs, you take a capital stake, not a debt stake. In the business. So if you lend, you get say 40% of it, which is basically combining banking with venture capital. At the moment, if you know, most venture capital firms, they have some of their own equity base, of course, but they frequently are borrowing money from the banks themselves.
Yes.
So you have the borrow money from the banks, which creates money, which is part of what the capitalist system needs to expand demand over time. They borrow the money, they then put it in a pool and they lend out to entrepreneurs and they take the equity stakes. I want to combine the two and then force bankers to actually think rather than just asking what's your collateral.
Okay, so we're going to have to wind up quite soon, Nora. But so basically, this is the answer to the question, can we avoid another financial crisis? The answer is yes, we can, with a debt jubilee as just described and this full-on reform to the banking system just described.
Yeah.
Anything else in there?
The answer is no, we won't avoid it because I know those...
Because those things won't happen.
Those won't happen. I'm getting more reception for a debt jubilee than I ever thought I would get. I even discuss it with family officers and I see them thinking about it, which I never thought would happen. But it won't happen. The politicians won't do it. And we've seen it in Japan for 25 years. That's what they should have done. They haven't done it. They haven't even thought about it. That's the terrifying thing. So we won't do it, and we're going to get, there's about 15 countries that managed to avoid the financial crisis, major countries, by continuing to borrow through the crisis. Canada being one of them, by the way, which is important here because our central bank governor came from Canada. So Canada and Australia, but also, of course, China, Sweden, Norway, Korea, are all countries which continued borrowing through the crisis. Now they've got to go through the same phenomenon of reaching a maximum level of debt and going down, so credit falls. And so I expect a financial crisis in all of those countries, whereas the rest of the world, including England and America and Europe, I describe as the walking dead of debt.
Okay. We're going to have to end it there at that miserable point. We've had some positives. Brexit is going to be fine. UK economy is in trouble anyway. We can't avoid another financial crisis. So apologies, readers who are looking for a more positive end to this. But Steve, thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's great fun.
Good to meet you.
Indeed.
Anticipating that there's going to be a run on cash, that people are going to want real cash. And by real cash, I mean dollars.
You mean actual notes?
Pieces of paper.
Actual notes.
Pieces of paper, because the whole economy works on credit.